Welcome to the Future of Payroll and Workforce Management Insights by HR.com, your go-to resource for insights into payroll and workforce management. From navigating compliance and technology trends to exploring the latest in global payroll solutions, we're here to keep you ahead of the curve. Join us as we dive into the forces reshaping payroll and share practical strategies to optimize your workforce management. Let's get started. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this episode of the HR.com podcast, Future of Payroll and Workforce Management. Here at HR.com, I am an executive community leader, leading the Future of Payroll Advisory Board and several other things. But this is not about me today. This is about my guest, Bob Ficken, who is AI Officer and CHRO at Ask HR Consultancy. Welcome, Bob.
Nice to be here, Brent.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for agreeing to be a repeat guest on the podcast. We always have great conversations. Today we're going to talk about something that's really interesting. It's something that I happened to write about for the magazine recently, and there's a big sort of trend in the industry, a push behind this, and I think it's positive and it's healthy. It's around this idea of the Chief Payroll Officer. Maybe it's time for that. But also implicit in that is this idea of, where should payroll sit? And before we get to that, whether it's finance or HR, but before we get to that, I like to ask all my guests, I've asked you this in the past, I'll ask you again for folks who haven't heard you yet on the podcast, what galvanizes you? What really gets you up and going every day when it comes to the world of work and just your career in general?
Sure. What gets me going is the opportunity to help an organization or help someone I meet reach their goals. That's challenging. I enjoy that challenge. I'm one of those strange people that the tougher the challenge, the more I enjoy doing it. So you give me an almost impossible objective and I'm your guy.
That's awesome. We all need more people like that in our lives. So thank you so much for being that guy. Let's get into it. So we have this sort of drive in the industry. I'll set the stage here, and I might get a little verbose, but I'll try to be as succinct as possible. But we have this drive. There's a lot of energy behind this aspiration or this goal set that we've set of bringing the payroll person into the C-suite with a C-suite role, Chief Payroll Officer. And by the way, I'm going to coin the term now. If it's already been coined, sorry, I'm not taking your trademarks away, whoever you are, but I'm going to call it the CPAO, the Chief Payroll Officer. And there's a lot of rationale behind this, a lot of energy. We want to bring some clout into the C-suite for payroll, which has always been sort of just trying. Maybe he's been in the back office for a long time, but starting to talk strategically and getting that catching the strategic bug and just trying to figure that out. But behind this, going one layer down, scratch beneath the surface, we have this idea that payroll is kind of half finances, half HR. What's going on here? And I know you have some strong opinions around this and some really interesting opinions as well, and a very good thought process. So with that prelude out of the way, I'm so glad I got it out of me. Where do you think payroll should sit? If it just within the organization, just not in the C-suite yet, but just in the organization, who should own payroll?
Sure. Well, first, I think there's a premise that's being made that we have to talk about momentarily, and that is that in 28 years of leading HR for multiple organizations, I have done cost-benefit analysis in every one of them, and I have never found an internal payroll department that can produce a check as cheaply as Paychex or ADP do. So I think that first we have to attack that, right? Because I have always found that no matter how efficient, how effective, how hardworking an internal payroll team is, they cannot meet the per check cost of ADP or Paychex. Okay. And I know payroll doesn't want to hear that, but that's the cost analysis.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to make sure for our audience so they understand. Are we talking about the technology or outsourcing it to maybe ADP or Paychex?
I'm talking about outsourcing payroll to ADP or Paychecks. You still are responsible for payroll. You have to submit your employees' hours and all those kinds of things, but they're the ones that actually do all the math, do all the withdrawal calculations. They take all the liability. They take all the liability for staying up to date on tax brackets for every state, for every country throughout the world. They take all the responsibility for your payroll deposits. They take all the liability, right? And they give you a lower per check cost, and they give you a way to replace a check immediately if you have to do that with a hard checkbook in your office.
You know what we're talking about here too is that operational side of payroll. What I've shared with folks, and I'm certainly not the origins of this idea, but I've just kind of noticed it, right? Is that, there are probably more than two sides, but let's talk about the two sides of the coin for payroll, right? You have the operational piece of it that ideally you want that to be the hum of the refrigerator in the background. That should be quiet.
Right.
And nobody even knows it's happening because it's just like clockwork. Every pay period, all the checks come out and they're correct, right?
Hopefully. Yeah.
Hopefully, yes. Yes. And when they're not, it's a big deal. Just like when the refrigerator breaks down. Now, watch my refrigerator break down. When you wake up in the morning and you turn on the light switch and the light comes on, you don't call up the power company and say, "Hey, thanks for sending me my electricity today," right? But when the electricity is not on, right, or when the refrigerator shut off overnight, it's an emergency. It's the same thing with payroll. It's so
I totally agree with you. We talked about that before. Payroll is the most thankless job there is. No one ever calls you up and says, "Thanks for getting my check right."
yeah. How
But
do we?
between the two, I absolutely think it belongs in finance. Happy to discuss why.
Why?
So I see it as a finance task simply because it involves tax deductions, it involves tax tables, it involves all those calculations, it involves payroll taxes, it involves Social Security taxes, unemployment taxes. All those things have to be accurate. Those are all financial related, right? They're the only strategic decision that goes into payroll is how often you're going to pay and what you're going to link pay to. And we talked about that a little bit last time. That, if you're not linking pay to what you want your employees to do, you're completely missing the boat. You want service, link it to service. You want sales, link it to sales. You want something else, link it to that. But unless you're paying people for what you want them to do, why are they going to do it?
And that's, what's interesting around that is we're talking about compensation strategy, and compensation strategy has sort of, traditionally, since we came up with the idea of talent management, kind of fallen under that a little bit more, which is the domain very much of HR. Um, how do we reconcile the two? How do we get the two to kind of talk to each other and act and cooperate and align?
Sure. Well, I think that the first of all, in my view, whether they like each other or not is inconsequential. The CFO and the CHRO should have a very dynamic partnership. They need to be talking weekly, if not more often. They need to be in lockstep. They need to be in the same place on all the different objectives and all that. They need to speak the same lingo. I found, for example, the better I learned CFO lingo, the better my CFO and I got along. If I stopped walking in there and saying, "We need to do this because it's good for morale," I'll deny. But if I walk in there and I say, "Hey, for an investment of $250,000, I can give you an ROI of 6 months and launch this thing, which will return a minimum of $500,000 to your bottom line. Is that okay?" Well, sure. And that's the difference, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. How do we? Is there a way for the CHRO to ever so slightly just open the CFO's mind to the idea of people as assets as opposed to what generally accepted accounting principles say that the payroll is a
Right.
liability. Like how do
Right.
we bridge that?
That's an interesting question, just from the viewpoint of so much of that has to do with your CEO and top leadership, right? I mean, you and I've talked off air a little about how important empathy is today in leadership, true empathy, authentic empathy, and those kinds of things. And so the issue becomes what we call farming in HR, which is to say, what I would do is I would go in, I'd talk, if I had a roadblock with the CFO, I'd go in and I'd say, hey, just so you know, I'm looking into this, that might be able to save us some money down the road. I'll get back to you. I'm not going to give them any reason to say no, or her any reason to say no. I'm just going to provide a little bit of an update, come back a week or 10 days later. Hey, I'm starting to get some results from this. I'll put it all together. I'll let you know. Come back another couple weeks later. And what happens is, by me not giving them a reason to say no and me feeding them all this information that's support for what it is I want to do, eventually it becomes their idea. And who cares whose idea it is, as long as it gets done, the right way. So that's a technique we call farming. Sometimes if I can go in there, if I can do all the cost benefit analysis and prove to them in language they understand, that helps. One of the biggest things that I do to try to get anything done is I attach the ROI and the cost benefit analysis to it. Show that I've already done that. I won't take anything forward that doesn't make sense. And that gets me in good graces with the CFO and the CEO.
So what you really, I think what I'm hearing is the HR leadership needs to get better at speaking. Well, you did say this, at speaking the lingo of the CFO, maybe Chief Operations Officer too, right? Just to understand where the C-suite is coming from, even the CHRO who's there in the C-suite, but really needs, to stay there and be as effective as possible to really understand how the rest of the C-suite thinks, and to, with that understanding, being able to, like you said, farming, or, and put another way, inject ideas or introduce ideas into that existing calculus of thinking so that it gets maybe pulled in and woven into the overall fabric of their thinking.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean, the bottom line is HR has to be better at quantifying everything it does in terms that make sense. And I have never found anything in HR I couldn't quantify. I mean, I can quantify hours reduced in employee relations issues. I can quantify time spent training and what we got for that. You gotta be able to quantify those things. And historically, HR has been terrible at tooting its own horn. On the other hand, usually no one's better at HR than using influence to get things done, because we have no direct authority over the CEO or COO or CFO, or the CIO or anyone for that matter. But we have to try to influence them to do the right thing. Right?
Yeah. Something interesting? It came up on another recording of this podcast. It also is not live yet. Of course, this one will be live and that one will be too by the time people hear this. But it's this idea that payroll folks, this idea of hiding, they don't hide payroll, right?
No.
Get it out in the open, and there's a way to kind of alert leadership to things coming down the pike, maybe compliance-wise with payroll, so that you are seen as a strategic advisor to leadership as opposed to the person to blame, and conversely, from the other standpoint, the payroll person's standpoint, scared to get in trouble if something goes wrong, right? Instead, it's kind of stepping into your power as a payroll person to kind of own it. And so that when the challenge arrives, I'm thinking things like, tax compliance, like new tax compliance regulation or whatever, right? So when it comes down the pike and actually starts happening, well, you've established that rapport with organizational leadership, and now you can approach the challenge sort of equally on a level playing field with organizational leadership, as opposed to, hey, why am I just hearing about this now? Just fix it or whatever, or these kinds of things.
Yeah, or a GAAP change. For example, many years ago when they changed it and said that paid time off had to be a forward-looking liability, and that impacted everybody's books.
Yeah. What do you think? from payroll standpoint, from the payroll department standpoint,
Right.
what is what benefit do they get from being rolled under finance as opposed to HR and the other way around? Like, what's the argument for the payroll department itself from their perspective?
I think first of all, they'll have some expertise in being better able to predict trends because the CFO probably has access to different associations and different publications and all that help them to stay aware of those things, can keep them up to date on deductions, whether it be unemployment or SDI or whatever it might be, keep up on all those changes, keep up on any pending legislation that might be in the state you're in or federally. Though that almost a full-time job in itself. Keeping up with all that. I mean, there's about 400 federal employment law changes or updates every year, and depending on what state you're in, there's another couple hundred. You know, so that can be almost a full-time job. So they get that. They can learn how to do trend analysis. They can learn how to do projections. They can learn how to balance inventory and all those different things. They can learn a lot of financial skills that will help them grow into maybe eventually being a CFO.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned growing into becoming the potential of the CFO, right?
Well, and if they want to go into HR, I've had systems where I've worked where we rotate an HR person into finance, into payroll, not finance, sorry, payroll, and a payroll person into HR.
Oh yeah.
For 6 months at a time, so we can learn more about what each other does and exchange ideas.
Yes, yes, sort of encouraging and facilitating cross-pollination, if you will, right, of ideas. What's interesting here is, again, going back to what you said, though, around, what I heard there was sort of establishing a potential career track to the C-suite for a dedicated leadership-minded, strategically thinking payroll person. And if you'd humor me for just a moment here, because I just had a conversation with a fellow who's also been on the podcast before. I just had a conversation with him earlier today, and we were talking about. I don't recall exactly how we got to this point, but it's very relevant here. We were talking about career pathing for payroll, and everybody who's in payroll, it seems like everyone you talk to in payroll, even the real leaders in it, almost all of them fell into it. It wasn't what it's definitely not what they went to school for necessarily, although maybe they gained the skill set that just so happened to be very applicable to payroll. But there are no degree programs necessarily. This is starting to change. And then you have Payroll.org that has this whole educational ecosystem around payroll certification and all this kind of stuff. But there's no career path like defined, like sort of in the culturally embedded career path, right? I'm going to go into finance. I'm going to go into accounting. I'm going to become an engineer, right? If someone says I'm going to become a payroll professional, okay, what's next? Like, where do they go next, right? And it occurred to me that part of it is sort of that a lack of a sort of a terminal position. Like, what's the ultimate role? Like, if you go into marketing, the ultimate role is a chief marketing officer. If you go into HR, the ultimate role is now a CHRO or maybe a chief people officer. If you go into business administration, the ultimate goal is potentially the ultimate role is CEO, maybe, right? So, and this is where it got funny. I'm sorry, I'm taking a lot of time here, but I gotta set the stage. So, is there a chief payroll officer, or is being good at payroll, does that mean, are we as just collectively mistaking this or saying, that if you're good at payroll, that means that you could potentially be good at being the CFO, or you could potentially be good at being the CHRO, or maybe even the COO. I don't know, right? Do you see what I mean? Like, are we too narrowly defining this thing as payroll because it's such a big, heavy lift? We just assume that it needs to have its own people doing it.
I would suggest that Well, I look at career pathing a little differently. First of all, I think every job category and every job within the job family should have multiple career paths. At least two, because one should be a higher level individual contributor role, because not everybody's good at managing, right? And that's an assumption companies make. And the second one is a higher level leadership role. And then where they fit in the succession plan? Maybe it's two or more roles. And I think in the case when you're doing it, you have to not only create job paths for the job category, but I also have to talk to the person, find out what their interests are, what their passions are. Because maybe when you have that conversation, you find out that they really would like to move into HR, or they'd like to move into marketing, or they'd like to move into this or move into that. And then you have to adjust that to accommodate that. Because the goal here is to motivate each employee to reach their full potential, not to tell them you've got no career path and you should look elsewhere. You don't want to give that message out, right?
Right.
I assume.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. Multiple career paths for any
Oh,
sort of entry level or lower level transactional role.
every job.
Mhm.
I have career paths for C-level people that either help them launch their own business, become a faculty member, become a speaker, whatever.
Yeah, yeah. It really is fascinating. It's fascinating to see how payroll is transforming, being seen as more strategic or aspiring to be more strategic, sort of again stepping into its power. And some of it is just the technology that has helped to equip payroll to be more in command of what it's producing, so that and in what it's doing, so that it can think, has the mental white space to do these things. It's certainly is an exciting time to be in payroll, and that we're even discussing um, where the payroll professional can go up the corporate ladder in their career. That we're even discussing this is such a sea change versus maybe 15 years ago or whatever. So that to me is encouraging.
Well, and I would even suggest that a person with really good payroll skills could have a career ladder that takes them both into finance and to HR and operations. Because if you understand payroll and how it's all connected, you can move in any direction because you have a multitude of skills.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Um, Bob, we've reached the end of our podcast episode today. We could talk about this for another hour, I think. Thank you so much for joining me again for another episode. This is a really important topic. I'm so glad that you contributed your thoughts to it. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Happy to do it, Brent.
Thanks for tuning in to the Future of Workforce Management and Payroll Insights by HR.com. We hope today's episode brought you valuable insights and fresh perspectives on the future of payroll and workforce management. Be sure to check out more episodes and explore resources at HR.com/podcast or wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, keep innovating and making a difference in the world of payroll and workforce management.